Congressional forums a year, and we are incredibly excited to hear what Congressman Fulcher has to say. He's back in D.C. He's been working on all of the legislation around the COVID-19 pandemic. But before we get to the Congressman, I would just like to thank our sponsors for today's event. As you know, the Boise Metro Chamber is the only 5-star accredited chamber in Idaho, and we are highly, highly dependent upon the support and the investment of our member organizations. And today we have some incredible sponsors of this congressional forum: Blue Cross of Idaho, St. Luke's Health Systems, Intermountain Gas, and Bank of Idaho. All four have just been incredible throughout this time and in working with us to adapt our programming so that as many people as possible can see it and as many people as possible can participate in this process. So before we start, just a quick message from Blue Cross of Idaho, and then we'll be off. Congressman Fulcher is a fourth-generation Idahoan from Meridian, Idaho. He served 10 years in the Idaho Senate, 6 of which were spent as the Majority Caucus Chair. And his signature legislation was a topic of debate this year, again, the grocery tax credit, which has returned $800 million to Idaho's families. Prior to serving, he also worked in the technology industry at Micron and Preco Electronics, and he worked all over the country and all over the world on behalf of those organizations. He currently serves on the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Power, and Oceans. He's a member of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Federal Lands, a member of the Education and Labor Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development, and a member of the Education and Labor Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions. We are very excited to have Congressman Fulcher here today. Congressman Fulcher, thank you for joining us. Thanks for being flexible throughout this time, and welcome.
My pleasure, Matt. Thanks for allowing me to come on. You'll notice I'm not wearing a mask, and a lot of people around here are asked to wear masks so that it's better for public safety. But when they ask me to put on a mask, it's to cover up my face. So that's the nature of the beast here in Washington right now. And unfortunately, I am here, and I'm definitely in the minority in terms of there's not very many of us here, which is a little bit problematic to me. And the issue of the day, actually, we are potentially going to do the first vote by proxy in the history of the United States Congress today. And I just heavily disagree with that. That's not the only reason that I'm here. I'll be voting in person, but I just think that there was never the intention of the Constitution, our founding fathers, to have members of Congress vote by proxy. But that's what's going to happen. You may have heard that there was a lawsuit filed last night. I am a plaintiff on that lawsuit to try to rectify the situation. I think that if we continue this process of voting by proxy, there's a tremendous shift of power. I think that ultimately translates first to leadership, then second, ultimately to the executive branch. And I don't think that Congress should forfeit that. I think it's a very bad precedent and a bad process. This over the course of time, Congress has been through a number of pandemics, a civil war, a couple of world wars, and even burning down the Capitol in 1812, but they still met and they did their job. And I think that's what we should be doing right now. So enough on that. But in the last year and a half, every single day that I've been in office, either impeachment or pandemic has been kind of the underlying situation. And as a result of that, plus just the overall dynamic, we're probably in the most adversarial time in history within the U.S. Congress. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of Representative Young from Alaska, who has been here and served since 1972. So he was actually the only member that was here during the Nixon era. and also Bob Latta. Bob is from Ohio. I think he went into office in 1989, but his father held the seat from 59 to 89. And so he's kind of the historian, or the self-proclaimed historian of Congress. And the two of them have told me that they believe this is the most adversarial time in the history of this Congress. So that has definitely put some challenge forward to myself, to our office, to other members. We've had to figure out how to build relationships in that environment, which has not been simple. And also, since I am in the minority party in the United States House, it's forced me and my team and staff to figure out ways to accomplish things that are not through the traditional legislative channels. So a lot of effort, excuse me, a lot of effort has gone into that. We have the benefit of having a very good delegation. And I can't say enough about Senator Risch, Senator Crapo, Representative Simpson, and how they have worked together with myself, helped me to make contacts that I wouldn't make normally that fast on my own, and to just get some internal connections that you have to have here if you're going to be functional. So please know that your Idaho delegation is working together very, very tightly. And I've told people before, no thanks to me, this delegation punches way above its weight. You've got the chairman of Senate Foreign Relations in Risch. You got the chairman of Senate Banking in Crapo. You've got a senior member of Appropriations with Simpson. And you know, the only thing that maybe I have contributed, I would say, to that team is potentially unifying a little bit out of selfishness, because I have wanted, needed, and asked for their guidance and their help, and it's possibly brought us together a little bit more. But that's just where we are. We've got a fabulous staff. I learned in business years ago that it's not just yourself and your efforts, but it's who you wrap around yourself, and it's what skill set do they bring, and they need to be able to shore me up and be strong where I'm weak, and provide just wise counsel, and not just be yes men and women. And we've done that. We've got a fabulous staff in Washington, D.C., in Lewiston, in Coeur d'Alene, in Meridian. And I think as a function of that, we've had an extremely effective constituent service effort. So when I went into this role, it was my initial thought that, okay, we need to figure out how to appropriately run legislation and accomplish things through legislative means, learn the rules. As most of you know, especially those of you who followed the state legislature, it's not often what you know, but it's who you know and how well do you know the process. Same thing here, but once again, the reality is I am a freshman in the minority, and I'm a sponsor or a co-sponsor of approximately 100 bills right now on a whole wide variety of issues. There might be one or two of them moving. And so once again, that underscores the need to figure out other ways to get things done in this particular environment. The other thing, of course, because of the pandemic, is working with the home state. And Governor Little has been a very good communicating partner in all of this. We've attempted to run as much ground game as we possibly can to help him in the efforts to coordinate things at the state level. As for those of you who've known me over the years, you know that I have a significant bias on local control and shifting things to state control and whatnot, and from federal. And so that's a big part of our effort right now, but it's taken another turn now with this pandemic. And so we find ourselves doing things we really hadn't intended to do. And right now it's trying to help the state and our businesses get opened up again. So here we are, we're a year and a half in, and I feel good about our staff accomplishments. I feel good about our relationships. I feel very good about the delegation, but it is not the direction we had initially planned on going. My initial plan was to try to be working on how to bring more resource jobs to our state, and and reduce regulations. We've done some of that, but the whole pandemic issue, the impeachment issue, has put a whole different spin on how to function in this role. So Matt, that's just a quick opening, and I'm happy if you're willing to coordinate. I'm happy to try to address some questions or go deeper on anything else you might want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and a great opening. And I can tell you, I can empathize, having served in the minority in Idaho for 8 years and the period of time when we served together. And maybe we start there. You're working in the minority at a time when the U.S. Congress is the most contentious it's been, at least in most people's memory. And what are you doing to help try to bridge that terrible gap that our country is currently working through?
It's a challenge, but it's all just like when you and I served together in the legislature, Matt. It is all down to relationships. This is a relationship business. There's 535 of us here plus one. And if you don't have those relationships, you're not going to accomplish a lot. And so our delegation has helped me start that process, but it has been extremely difficult even to get meetings and appointments with certain other members. And so a number of you may have heard this story, but months ago, we took another tact, and this will sound goofy to some, but we routinely will make a little gift bag. We'll take an Idaho Spud candy bar from the Hawaii Candy Company. We'll take a bag of potato chips, or Idaho potato chips, and I'll put a personal handwritten note, and we'll send to a member, starting with the majority members on the committees I serve with, and just a personal note to say, it's a pleasure to serve with you. And then about 3 or 4 days later, I'll call up and I'll ask for a meeting, and 9 times out of 10, I'll get it. People remember the Spud. It might sound like a goofy tactic, but you have to start someplace. So that's first and foremost, is just building those relationships. And I believe that we probably are and certainly as good a position as any freshman member as a result of that, just with those relationships. But there's a couple of other things. One is as long as there is a Trump-Pelosi dynamic, this place is going to be on its ear. I mean, this is oil and water. This is yin and yang, whatever you want to call it. But these are opposing forces of nature that have the tendency to suck the oxygen out of the room. And so we've been through impeachment 1. We're going to be, there's the impeachment 2. There's the Barr investigations, and it's just immense. But my point is that I hope that when November comes, regardless of the outcome of November, when November comes, that dynamic will be shaken up. If for no other reason, both Pelosi and Trump may still be here, and they might still be in their same roles. They might not be, or they might be in different roles. But my hope is that dynamic gets shaken up a little bit, because it does suck the oxygen out of the room. So November is a very critical part of this. There is one other thing, Matt, and that is the importance, just like you and I did in the Idaho legislature, just like happens every year with majority and minority, you have to find those things that you can agree on, and you have to work on those together and put an R and a D on a bill and go pass it. And so right now that's happening. It's a little bit slow, but it's with FISA reform. And those are the types of things that we need to continue to focus on. And as you might recall, when you do that, you're successful with it, it does have a tendency to be contagious. And so we need a joint win. I'm hoping that FISA reform is that issue.
Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic and the economic stimulus bills that have come out of Congress. The first 2 were helpful in some ways to businesses of a certain size, but a lot of businesses have really had trouble accessing the PPP loans and the economic injury disaster loans through the SBA. The governor of Idaho has done a good job of providing an alternative avenue for sole proprietors and companies that don't have employees. But the feds seem to be stuck on what the next step is in order to kind of help some of these businesses that just took it right in the teeth during April and May. And I know that Speaker Pelosi said that the bill the House passed was an opening salvo. But can you explain, what was in it that you think would be beneficial and what was in it that was a non-starter for the Republican caucus?
Yeah, it wasn't just the Republican caucus. There was a significant number of Democrats that had issue with it as well. I think it only passed by 9 votes, and I have personally communicated with Leader McConnell, and it is dead in the Senate as we speak. But it was $3 trillion bill, Matt, and I think that the positive things were it did extend PPP, and it opened up some of those parameters a little bit. Where it lost my support and the support of many others was when so many other things were rolled into it. There were pension funds for a whole bunch of different organizations that were reimbursed. There were bailouts, not loans. There were things that went into non-COVID related, non-employment related issues. I love the arts, but now's not the time to in my opinion, to throw a ton of money at that type of thing. And so the fact that it strayed so far, there were some other provisions in it in releasing prisoners and doing things that I think would be detrimental on our southern border by opening that up too much, too quick, too freely. And so it covered policy that didn't have anything to do with the pandemic. And that's where I think it went astray. In terms of moving forward, I think what you'll see, at least that just went off. Can you see me all right? Because my automatic light there we go.
There we go. We can see you. You've been sitting still too long.
I know. I'm not used to doing that. But I think what you're going to see is, and it probably will be a while, best guess is maybe a month or so, what comes as a response from the Senate will highly likely have some provisions in there for payroll, tax breaks. It'll be more focused on pandemic employment related things. I think you'll probably see some liability protection provisions in there for businesses that opened up. And if they saw an outbreak, some kind of a safe harbor, if you will, to try to encourage businesses to open up on that front. The president has talked about, Leader McConnell's talked about, Leader McCarthy's talked about, even the possibility of extending the tax date until September this year. I think the overall number will be significantly less, and pretty much the focus is shifting from stimulus to try to coordinate and help our various states facilitate the opening up. And this will not surprise you, but a tremendously broad array of issues between Idaho, Arkansas, Florida, New York, California. We're all just in different situations. And so I think the president has appropriately tried to encourage governors to do what they think is best for their state. And that's certainly what we've attempted to try to support Governor Little with, is just to do what he believes is best. And so best guess, probably about a month. And I think you'll see those types of components in the next package.
I think you and I both have been on the same page with regard to debt and deficits over the year. And in the last couple of years, especially now with the pandemic and the economic stimulus associated with that, we've increased our national debt astronomically. Do you see solutions around how to deal with our debt while still maintaining the programs that people expect, like Social Security and Medicare and some of these other programs that our senior citizens need? How do we address what is becoming a singular problem for our country?
How much time we got, Matt?
As much time as you want.
I have personally talked with the president twice, and this was my primary topic of discussion both times. in my opinion, unfortunately, Steve Mnuchin was present both times. And so, by the way, Steve Mnuchin is a great guy, and he definitely has a president's ear, but we disagree on this particular issue. I'm deeply concerned about it, and I know Senator Crapo is deeply concerned about it, and he can address it better than I can. But the first time I met with the president was the economy was doing very, very well, and I said, Mr. President, if there is an asterisk in the performance of this economy, it would have to do with the debt. And since I have been in office, I'm not aware of any serious discussions that are attempting to address this. And so, just like you might anticipate, he says, okay, what do we do? And I remember having similar conversations back in the business world when, some young exec comes up and says, hey, here's a problem. And one of the first things I'd say, okay, hotshot, what's the answer? Which is basically what he said to me. Okay, hotshot, what's the answer? So I used Idaho's situation as an example. Back in 2000, I think it was 9, we had a shortfall with like a lot of states, you may recall, the economy went off a cliff. We had the subprime loan issue, and boom, I think revenue to the state of Idaho fell by about 24%. We happen to be in much better shape than most places, but one of the things we did was we took what surplus we had and we pulled that back around, and we used the surplus in part to pay down our expenses. And we were running, with the first time I had this conversation, we were running at pretty significant surplus at the federal level. And I said, I realize this is not simple, but if there's just a way that we could hold the line on where we are, and with the help of some others, we'd done some math. And we had some modest growth. It was continuous. Yes, it was a 30 or a 40-year time frame to get things evened out. But if we just tried to hold things steady and pull some of the surplus in and use that strictly for debt pay down, then there was at least the beginning of a plan. The secretary didn't particularly care for that idea. I didn't think it was realistic, and it might not be, okay? But my point was to try to get something going on it. His point, valid one, was, look, with things like Medicare, there's just no real way to predict what that's going to be. To sort of try to hold the line on it's very difficult. I get that. Good point. We had a follow-up conversation maybe a couple of months later, and there were some other things on the table, but I brought it back up again. And the secretary, again, this was a conversation with the president, but the secretary was there. He says, look, I'm not worried about deficits. As long as our growth is exceeding our deficit level, I'm not worried about it. And we just fundamentally disagreed. So, the growth is not going to be there forever. And in that case, I was right. Like, how about now? Okay, it's not there. So, Matt, it's not being addressed to my knowledge. It should be being addressed. You brought up an interesting point in without necessarily overhauling Social Security or Medicare. I don't know what the percentages of those two things, but it's a big number, and it's a death knell to put those on the table if you're running for re-election. But ultimately, if we can't have some kind of a strategy, that's going to have to be dealt with, and so that's probably not a good answer, but it's the best I got.
If you hear vibrating, they've decided to replace the water main in my street in front of my house today, so that's what that noise is. But let's talk a little bit about infrastructure and transportation infrastructure. With the pandemic, the last 2 months, people haven't been driving. So in most cases, the gas tax, which is the primary funding of infrastructure spending, has fallen through the floor. Is there anything at the federal level? I know that President Trump has talked about trying to do some massive transportation and infrastructure program as a piece of this. And it really is a big problem for us, whether it's expanding broadband, which we've learned a lot of students in Idaho still don't have access to broadband as they're at home. Many of our roads need expansion and fixing. Talk to us a little bit about where the feds are and where you see transportation infrastructure going from a federal level.
I do think, I don't know if it'll be part of the phase 4. From what I'm told, it would be separate from that, but a federal effort to try to stimulate an infrastructure project with a twofold goal of trying to stimulate employment and trying to improve the backbone or that skeletal structure that we all need to have commerce. And this gets into another area that is very, very important for your members to understand, because it impacts absolutely everything. Idaho is one of a relative few number of states that is primarily owned by the federal government. I'm not arguing if that's good or bad. I'm just pointing out that makes a huge difference on everything, especially when it comes to infrastructure, because we don't own it. We don't have the access to property tax. So when I'm on the resource committee and I bring something like this up and we're talking about infrastructure, people from the Midwest, the East, they have no concept of what it's like to try to govern in a state where property tax is largely off the table. And so we do not look at this thing in the same vein. The way I see it, as structured, the federal government is a quasi-landlord in the state because of how that land ownership goes, and landlords have responsibilities. If you rent a house and there's a hole in the roof or a pipe breaks or whatever, generally speaking, the landlord has some responsibility in keeping that infrastructure in place. And that's how I see it with the state of Idaho. The way we're structured, we're simply not allowed the resources necessary for a strong way to support that infrastructure. So a couple of things going on. Number one, we're in a unique situation where I believe the federal government has a bigger responsibility than in most states. Number two, it's how we deliver that. And I think you're going to see a separate package. And not knowing about it, I can't tell you that I would support it or not. I'm very sensitive to debt. At the same time, I know that we have to have that skeletal structure available so that we can promote commerce. And I also know that a large part of that needs to be at the expense of federal dollars because of the land mix. So the best thing I can probably say there is, Matt, stay tuned and we're going to work through this together. And by the way, when it does come forward, I would absolutely like to get comments from your members and yourself on just what you think about it and where we should be trying to emphasize things and where we should not.
You mentioned the federal lands issue, and rural communities in Idaho are kind of doubly hit by this pandemic. One is the stay-at-home has had an incredible impact in exposing some of the shortcomings of lack of infrastructure. But second to that, the increase in online sales is going to further weaken our rural communities. Have you thought about trying to figure out a way to improve payment in lieu of taxes, PILT payments, as a function of this expansion in order to help our rural communities? And if so, how would you change PILT payments and secure in rural schools to make the feds a better landlord if that was the path you had to take?
Well, first of all, I believe there's some good news that's either been formalized or not. But in that last round of stimulus dollars, we had joined with the governor's office in requesting a waiver so that some of those dollars that went to the state for state discretionary spending could be used for broadband. And I believe, I don't have my staff member immediately close by, but I believe that's approved. And so don't hold me to that, but that was my understanding that we could do that, and that's a big step to your point about getting the broadband approved. The PILT and SRS, I hate to say it, but it's in my words, they're kind of on an autopilot right now. They were built in to certain pieces of legislation, and there's a formula akin to what we use at the state level for education funding. You know, we have that complicated formula that's got, you know, the population of the school, the head count, a number of other things that are all mixed in with that. And so PILT and SRS are, until we can get that formula changed, which is not simple to do, then we're left to other devices. Remember, the states who have access to that, or I should say, are extremely dependent on it, are the ones where there is primarily federal land. That's one of those things that makes us different. And so to go to a colleague from Connecticut or Rhode Island or Florida or wherever and say, hey, look, I want to talk to you about SRS. You know, I mean, because they just have, it's just not something that is relevant to them. And so, not to segue too much, but by the way, that's another reason why it's very important for Congressman Simpson and I, for example, to be members of the Western Caucus, because at least in that arena, Republican and Democrat, you can leverage each other's strength and do things in numbers, because most of the members of the Western Caucus are from states where PILT and SRS are important. So that's where we are in that, Matt.
You know, Idaho is another thing that's attached to our public lands. Is our third largest economic driver is recreation and tourism. A lot of the businesses that are dependent upon recreation and tourism, including hotels, convention centers, and then our outdoor community and all of the guiding that occurs, have really been hurt by the pandemic. Is there anything, I know there's a House Bill 6697 that's out there that addresses some tourism industry stuff, but is there anything that you see coming down the pike to help our recreation and tourism, especially if large gatherings continue to be difficult?
Yeah, so to me, this is a direct function of just getting the economy switched back on. Airlines, when the economy is cooking, airlines are cooking. When the economy's cooking, people are taking vacations and they're traveling around. Other than what you mentioned in the hospitality arena, I'm not aware of anything directly targeted at that. That's not to say there's not something out there. I'm just not aware of it if there is. But this is a direct fallout. This is a direct derivative of just how well our economy is functioning, Matt. And in my view, this just underscores the importance of switching things on quicker, trying to enable things as much as possible. Probably, and I know this isn't a direct impact, but the liability safe harbor for businesses is potentially one of those things to encourage some of that activity. And that's not sidestepping it. There's a lot of businesses, there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of individuals who said, look, I'm anxious about getting everybody back together in the same roof and doing their jobs, because what if there is an outbreak? Then I'm sued, and you know, the insurance companies have outs and all this. So the liability thing may be an important component of that, but at the end of the day, we just got to let the markets work. If we let the markets work, then those things start to take care of themselves. Just, what was it, 13 weeks ago, we're at an all-time high in a lot of these areas. And now, you know, I don't know if we're at an all-time low, but we're close probably. And so it's, Matt, this is just a function of trying to do everything we can to enable the economy. Liability might be part of it. Further reg reduction might be part of it. I do kind of like the idea of the payroll tax break, just because I think there's a direct link to economic stimulation, to employment on that front. People are employed, the economy's going, there's liquidity. then the tourism is going to kick back in.
There's a question here that's asking about what the feds can do to help further enable telehealth and telemedicine in places like Idaho. And so I'm not sure if you have any insight on that, but I thought I'd give it a shot.
Yeah, well, there's I forget the categories, but there's a significant portion of the monies that came through in phase 3.5, I think it was, to specifically enable the telehealth component. And in a state like ours, it's a great question. It's a great point. And I know there's significant efforts within our state. I've actually seen some of the control room at St. Luke's. I actually went through that not long ago, and it's impressive, and we need it. So the waivers, the accessibility, at least for the stimulus, is there. What would be helpful for me, as I think about it, is okay. If you're a provider, and I'm sure there's probably some kind of barriers if you're a provider for telehealth. What are those? Are they regulatory? Are they legal? Because here's just on a broad array of topics. If there was ever a time where business needed some flexibility from the federal government, or a waiver, or a reduced regulation or something, now is probably the best time to ask, because there's more flexibility than I've ever seen when I was working from the state perspective, or now here at the congressional level. Surprisingly, they're very responsive, and many times we make the request, boom, done. And so help educate me. Tell me where you might need the help. I know the telehealth is a big part of our future. It's here to stay. We need it. We've got the rural marketplace that probably can't function without it moving forward. What do we need to do? I think there's some resources there through some of the stimulus, but that's short term. We all know it. Where are the barriers? Help us know what they are, and we'll try to reduce them.
I know you're busy and you've got a lot to do in DC, so just one more question. You've been in Congress now for a year and a half, and in that year and a half, I'm sure the learning curve is something twice as difficult as what it was in the Idaho legislature. But what are you most proud of in your first term, and what would you say your big accomplishments are at this point?
Most proud of our constituent service effort. Thousands, I think I'm fair to say thousands of people have reached out to the staff in our offices, and they've been living through very trying times, and on every issue you can possibly imagine. And they either have issues with Medicare, or a veterans issue, or trying to get family members home from Senegal. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And if I ever need a little bit of encouragement, I go sit in those offices and I help field a call, or just interact with our team there, because many times we're able to help people navigate this federal bureaucracy, this tremendous amount of red tape. And so that's probably first and foremost. And they get a lot of angry calls too, people just frustrated, and a lot of times we can't do anything, but there's a lot of times where we can. So that's the thing that I probably appreciate the most. The other thing I would say is, despite the partisanship, despite the adversarial nature of this environment, I believe that if you went to any member of this body, Republican or Democrat, who I've actually got a chance to know, I believe they would say, this is somebody who thinks about stuff. This is somebody that will not stick a dagger in our back publicly, privately. He'll tell us what he thinks, and he'll act that way. And I believe that there's perhaps a little bit of credibility that may have been brought up. So those relationships are important. Same thing within our own federal delegation. We had what I think is a significant win just recently. And among other things, I still am I'm a commercial real estate broker. I still have that license. Obviously, I'm not actively doing it, but I'm still legal that way. And I know the importance of 1031 exchanges. And with those timelines, there's no way that anyone with 1031s were going to execute when you got a shelter-in-place order. So we requested a waiver on that. We got it, and that went nationwide. And so, that just happened to be because I understand that reasonably well. We've got a lot of legislation out there, admittedly, and not a lot of that is moving. But I have the cell phone number for the Secretary of Ag and the Secretary of the Interior. I don't use them, at least not very often. But when you have to, and you got a BLM issue, for Idaho Forest Service issue, whatever, they're there and they respond. And I feel very good about those types of things.
There's one more question here. Any chance you can make some of the healthcare flexibilities permanent? Some of them have been extremely beneficial to Idaho, and if you're moving forward with another bill, is it possible to make some of those permanent?
Yeah, and so once again, I think their answer is yes. Help me identify what the ones that are most critical, most beneficial for Idaho. We've got a number of things out there right now having to do with just choice and some of the health saving, medical saving plans and whatnot that are being allowed, at least for now, short-term health bridges and those types of things. But I think the opportunity is there. So help me identify those, and we'll go for it.
Well, I want to thank you for demonstrating flexibility and doing this congressional forum virtually. It's our first ever virtual congressional forum and your first congressional forum. So thank you for that. We very much appreciate it. I want to give a shout out to your staff as well. I mean, Mike and Michelle here in Boise have been incredible. And then certainly former Senator Baer, Daniel, Alexa in your DC offices have all been very welcoming. We are thankful to be able to be in contact with them and work with them on issues specific to the chamber. And I won't keep you sitting still much longer, but I just want to thank our sponsors one more time: Blue Cross of Idaho, St. Luke's Health Systems, Intermountain Gas, Bank of Idaho. They have been critical to keeping us going. And one last plug for the chamber. We'd love it if you'd consider House Bill 6697. Chambers haven't been able to access the PPP loans, and that would be a great solution to help us. And with that, Congressman Fulcher, I hope to see you again soon in Idaho, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, and I appreciate the council. We're way open to that, and thank you for acknowledging that, staff, Matt. Well, man, you can't do anything without good staff, and they make me look good even when I don't. But when I look bad, I can do that all by myself.
I've been there. I get it. Have
Right.
a great afternoon, and good luck in the halls there. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.